These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down.
From WSNC 90.5 FM broadcasting service and NPR affiliates of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, African and Afrofuturism as Africa's ancient future, the freedom principle. Africa World Now Project is next. Today we will listen to a thinking session I had with students last year where we engaged ideas around an argument I presented that suggested Afrofuturism is an ancient idea that expresses itself as an Africana freedom principle. It is an articulation of a constellation of deep Africana ideas and practices of what I called Africa's ancient future, a nod to Wayne Chandler's Ancient Future. Through historical and ancestral memories of magic, use of spiritual technologies, intentional philosophies of life, heretical temporality, creative nonlinear knowledge production, and a symbiotic connection with nature and the universe, Africa's ancient future is articulated through a freedom principle, which implies a constant struggle to delink one's collective self from now moments, reconciling past moments in order to create future moments that allow the full expression of one's humanity. To thoroughly understand the ideas that we were engaging during this session, we must understand Afrofuturism as dominantly expressed and studied as a contradiction and a product of distorted conceptualizations of time. A distortion that reinscribes racialized perspectives and perceptions of history and demonization of Africana advanced understandings of it. More frankly, a negating of it, a shaming of it, with the use of pejoratives such as CP time, or black folks are always late. What was of specific importance to our interrogation of the time concept was its arrested expression as a Western European construct. The temporal ticks used to mark the flow of human phenomenon and phenomena are mapped from distorted perceptions of a limited reality, perceptions that were born from a historical and ancestrally specific cultural worldview, then forced upon the world through enslavement, colonialism, imperialism, language, and religious violence. The idea of Afrofuturism as an arrested concept is found in the question which is often associated with its origins, as posed by Mark Deary. He asked, can a community whose past has been deliberately rubbed out and whose energies have subsequently been consumed by the search for legible traces of its history imagine possible futures? Folk are more intentionally unpacking the interdependent categories of thought that inform such a question and its implications on the way the Africana world is understood, specifically the West's consistent imperial project of defining what Africana is and is not. Nevertheless, Afrofuturism and its relation to an arrested time concept limits the ability to understand Africana experiences, relegating them to temporal categories defined by the conceptualizations of a white Western imagination that are inherently limited in its ability to even conceptualize an Africa's ancient future. The reductionist approach to the vastness of Africa's philosophies of life, deep understandings of cosmology, complex systems of knowledge, the multiplicity in Africana understandings of what it means to be human are problematic to say the least. This brings us to Nnedi Okorafor, one thinker and writer who has presented an important intervention and one pillar of thought upon which I critically engage Afrofuturism. Okorafor writes, and I must quote in its totality, I am an African futurist and an African jujuist. African futurism is a subcategory of science fiction. African jujuism is a subcategory of fantasy that respectfully acknowledges the seamless blend of true existing African spiritualities and cosmologies with the imaginative. African futurism is similar to Afrofuturism in the way that blacks on the continent and in the black diaspora are all connected by blood, spirit, history, and future. The difference is that African futurism is specifically and more directly rooted in African culture, history, mythology, and point of view as it then branches into the black diaspora, and it does not privilege or center the West. African futurism is concerned with the visions of the future, is interested in technology, leaves the earth, skews optimistic, is centered on and predominantly written by people of African descent, black people, and is rooted first and foremost in Africa. It's less concerned with what could have been and more concerned with what is and can and will be. It acknowledges, grapples with, and carries what has been. Okorafor ends her intervention with this: African futurism does not have to extend beyond the continent of Africa, though it often does. Its default is non-Western. Its default center is African. This is distinctly different from Afrofuturism. This brings us back to what I intended to do with the young minds in this session of our semester course, which was to present ideas that culminate into an argument that pushes us to think about the ways we understand Africa and the concept of time in relation to the future as defined by a freedom principle. I wanted to present ideas that allows us to think critically about the past, present, and future in an attempt to push me and them to think about the uses of a radical imagination and creativity to envision African futures, to think beyond struggle while struggling, ultimately situating struggle in a long genealogy of resistance at all levels of human existence. Black radicalism's esoteric dimensions. This session, as with all sessions where I engage with thoughts and ideas, whether it's with students or in the community, was intentionally and deliberately unorthodox. We wanted to pull on events, people, and places that are not normally engaged in dominant discourses in the academy. Therefore, to clearly outline the argument I'm making, I do so now in order for you to follow the conversation you are about to hear, all while provoking and inviting you to think with me, think beyond me, think around me, think over me, think through me, but think nonetheless. The argument as presented then and today suggests that in order to understand Afrofuturism or African futures as an intellectual theoretical frame or lens through which to understand the place of Africa in a future is a very ancient idea. I argued that we must map its provocations at various moments to be extracted from the deep cultural fabric of Africana people, which is an interdependent relationship between the material and spiritual, a way of life, to its development as an epistemic frame through which we can see all Africana ways of knowing reassert itself on a global stage as the progenitor of all human knowledge. Communities, the people that inhabit the geographical spaces referred to as continental Africa, have always been acutely aware of the future. The cultural practices and current religious forms and functions are rooted in a deep African spiritual understanding and worldview. This is not a profound acknowledgement. However, the future, the concept of the unseen, a moment that is to come, is prevalent and vital to highlight. The relationship to land, the universe, and ancestors are centered around an understanding of the seamless interconnectedness of past, present, and future, and we have a duty and responsibility to maintain it in balance, which is and can be important to apply as a socio-political organizing principle. This is another point and program altogether, of course, but important to highlight nonetheless, especially if we situate this argument I'm making in discourses around socio-political and economic relations, which will then highlight the limits of rights discourse, which are currently rooted in individualist notions where duty and responsibility can be negated by the rule of law, which is birthed in the reconceptualization of the human as a justification and maintenance for private property. How do we know Africana peoples have always been acutely aware of the future to be a fact? Categories of thought related to time, reconceptualized through a European imposition of a specific worldview, operates to divide whatever it engages with. However, categories of thought that are embryonic to Africana ways of knowing are inherently dialectical, mathematical, and carry multiple meanings through and with what is considered unorthodox language patterns, all inherently connective, seeking to constantly reconcile continuities to nature, to community, to the universe. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descended communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Enjoy the program.
We segue into the way that I think about Afrofuturism, and I'm going to use African future as a concept for us to be a little bit more clear about what we're talking about, because I want us to understand that this notion of Afrofuturism has a historical specificity as being a concept to explain or to be a platform or an area or a scope or a lens through which to understand an ancient people. And so for me, I tend to I like the concept of an ancient future as being the foundation that has a longer trajectory or a longer genealogy in ancient African past. And the reason why I say that is because if we're thinking about an Afrofuturism as an intellectual or theoretical frame or a lens through which to understand the place of Africa in the future, we have to understand that the future or time or temporality is something that Africans in the ancient context have always understood, and always understood at a deep level through cultural expression, material expression, but also through the spiritual practices and also the philosophical understandings and also the idea of language and the use of the invocation of different types of undercurrents or underthoughts of words or ideas. And so to understand this particular argument that I'm making is that an Afrofuturism has a genesis in an ancient African past, is that we must understand and examine it as first an idea, and also secondly as a material or cultural expression. And what we're alluding to here is that to understand, this concept of an Afrofuturism as being a continuum that is a lens through which we can examine and map this very ancient idea to an African future. And I'm thinking about this in the same way that we think about Pan-Africanism. And so to study Pan-Africanism, we have to study it as in two ways. We have to study it first, obviously, as an idea, but also in ways that it attempts to institutionalize itself or to recognize itself. And so we study Pan-Africanism with a little p as being the idea, the sentiment, the expression, the philosophical, the unconscious, or the non-dominant ways that Africans express themselves throughout time and space, but also the attempts of Africans to institutionalize that through, obviously, the congresses, but also in many other variations and expressions through seeking freedom, or the ideas of seeking freedom, or the ideas of establishing, the notion of freedom and justice. And so a place that we can see Afrofuturism coming together in both idea and an institutional or material expression, I argue, is that its most vibrant is through maroon communities. And so this very ancient idea, as we're mapping through time and space, is that we see the impulse of Africans to envision and recreate, I shouldn't say recreate, but to create a new way of understanding or a new way of being, despite the conditions within which they're forced, despite the conditions within which they find themselves. So I think that it is important for us to highlight the central premise of African or Afrofutures, that there must be a contradiction that must be contended with, the dialectic between the racist notions of Africa as being primitive and also the notion of a future projection, or the projection of an Africa into the future. So in order to really understand what we're talking about, this intellectual, theoretical frame or lens that we are associating with, or we're dealing with today as being an Afrofuturism / African future, and you're going to hear me say this throughout our engagement tonight, is because I want us to understand a lot of times Afrofuturism is arrested in a certain particular frame of reference or a disciplinary understanding. And so what people have been doing, a lot of people who have been dealing with this concept, including myself, is kind of really moving it outside of the tendencies to deal with it in a very limited way, just based upon science fiction or speculative fiction, as we allude to or point to. But we generally have to understand it, as I'll argue, and as I'm arguing, is a very ancient idea that has multiple expressions. And we're going to talk about those expressions. One of those expressions I just showed you, I just talked about, I just said, was maroon communities. But we have an ancient idea of an expression of an African future with the Sankofa bird and the Adikra symbols. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, to understand that Africans, and my argument here is that Africans or Afrofuturism or an African future is a very ancient idea, even though we generally give a credit to Mark Deary in the 1990s, who is a cultural critic, who was the one who coined the term Afrofuturism. Again, I am the type of person who really thinks that it's important for us to not really pin down or limit the origins of things to one particular era, one particular point, because then we miss a lot of the evolutions and a lot of the contributions of the different variations of the different ideas and the different ways that people have been expressing an Afrofuturism or an African future. But generally, in an academic term, and we'll deal with it academically now, is that Mark Deary, a cultural critic, coined the term Afrofuturism in a essay that he was writing called Black to the Future. And in this essay, he generally posed a particular question that I think that most of us have dealt with on some level, in some way, no matter what age you are, particularly if you're looking at the different productions or the different ideas that have expressed themselves through movies, through literature. And being a cultural critic, that generally is when folk kind of, dealing with that aesthetic part. That's the reason why aesthetic, or the material expression of Afrofuturism, tends to have a more weight on than its philosophical or its historical or ancestral genealogy. But that's the argument that I'm making tonight. And that is what I'm putting forth tonight, along with the aesthetic or the material expression of an Afrofuturism. We also have to include, those deeper frameworks in order to map it in its longer tradition or in its ancient tradition. So if we are to do this within basically tracing this ancient idea, we have to obviously, as I said a few minutes ago, is to really understand that there's a dialectic here. There's a dialectic centered on the racist notions of Africa as being primitive, yet instill the understanding that Africa is the future within the past, but also as we're moving forward. Why do I say that? Of course, all of the technology, all of the material expressions of a future, if we're looking at it in a very, very limited sense of its aesthetic or its materiality, such as cars, such as phones and access to information and the use of airplanes and those types of things, is that, interestingly enough, of course, most of the natural resources that allow those things to be considered to be futuristic come from the continent of Africa itself. Now, those things have always been there as well in Africa, along with the people itself. So as we muck through this process of the interdependent complexities, in order to leave here with some sense of the breadth and depth of what is essentially Africa and the time concept that we are associating with an Afrofuturism, but moving it beyond its arrested, limited understanding of time from a European conceptualization, is important that we understand it through a series of ways, right? One of those particular ways, or one of those themes, is literature or word. Another theme is thought, and another theme is expression. Why is it important to do this? As I'm arguing, is that we have a very clear understanding of Afrofuturism being expressed or being understood in literature and word. And we also have a particularly fairly good understanding of the expression, of Afrofuturism as being expressed through cultural production. Our culture is a platform for the material expression of the freedom principle. And so, but what we don't have in the conversation too much is the thought or the principle of the freedom principle of thought that is captured in this notion of an Afrofuturism. But let's deal with Afrofuturism, and we muck through it, and we're going to take it apart to understand its ancient roots.
I don't know, I feel like maybe the thought behind it kind of manifests itself within the material, I feel like.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
Because for instance, like me, myself, like the way that I approach like rap or like even like basic cover art, I'm using like various elements from like, I don't know.
And that I don't know is what I'm actually talking about. So because we have its expression and we have a clear, like I said, we have a pretty good understanding of Afrofuturism as being a concept that is expressed through obviously word, right? Literature. I'm even going to expand that particular notion in a minute of us even moving it through word and the concept of something that is an expression that has a deep, deep meaning, okay? And I think, and so the material expression, but that I don't know that you just said is exactly where I am arguing that is where you have to look at ontology, epistemology, those particular frames of understanding to put together, it's the glue. So right now it's an orbit. You're absolutely right. You use, your words and then you attach material to it. But however, what is it that pushes you through? What is it the thought processes, and what is it that you're using to even take you there? And what I'm arguing is that is a more ancient tradition. And that what we're really talking about here is one particular thread or one particular instance of an idea of a future that Africans expressed in ancient terms that was beyond just the moment or just that particular, let me just express myself in this particular instance because this is the way that I feel. The way that I feel has to move over time and space, and we have to unexplain what that is. Tayoki, you had something?
Oh, because I was going to ask you, what did you mean by freedom principle of thought?
We're about to get to, okay? In order for us to really understand this concept, and again, because my argument here is that we first have to understand this notion of an African future or an Afrofuturism as being an ancient idea, because again, it was coined, in a particular period of time. And it was coined in a particular period of time in a particular discipline and a particular way that people were a cultural critic who was examining the cultural production, first of all, that was born of a European concept. That's the reason why I said the contradictions are important. The idea that Africa has no history that is primitive, yet and still is producing every particular idea that we have known, even the idea of a space, even the idea of a reality beyond reality, even the idea, as I mentioned to you guys earlier, in quantum physics or in molecular biology, is that Africans had a principle that was expressed particularly when we talk about the notion of the atom, the notion of Amun, right? The hidden, which that's an idea, but how does it express itself? How do you wrap something around that particular principle that can carry over through time and space? That becomes important, okay? All right, so in order for us to be able to really understand this, we really have to understand that Afrofuturism or an African future has these components. In order to understand it, we have to understand it as word. We have to understand it as an idea, but also as an expression. Let's deal with this. The category of word or literature or written has two strains of thought running through it, but they are connected if you go down both paths, right? So what that means is that this particular thread of an African futurism or an Afrofuture through word and literature means that there is an expression of an African humanity as an active agent of one's life and lived experiences in order to be free, right? So what do I mean by that? If you're looking at the notion of everything that is written in the construct or in the category of an Afrofuturism or an African future, whether it's literature or whether it's through word, it always has an expression of freedom. There's a freedom component, a freedom principle that is always underlining, that is attached to this idea of a future. The idea of a future always has a freedom principle that is ingrained or that is wrapped into it. This idea of I am moving from this particular place and these particular conditions to another place and to other conditions that also contribute to my particular freedom. If I get to that particular place and those particular conditions are impinging upon my freedom, I need to move to another place within which this future moment also has a freedom principle that is always attached to it. So that's what I mean by the freedom principle, is that when we're thinking about this concept of an African future or an Afrofuturism, is that the principle that runs through it, that connects all of these particular categories when we're trying to really assess and understand Afrofuturism or an African future as a theoretical frame of reference, we have to understand, again, that there's a freedom principle there, okay? So what do I mean here? So the writers that are associated with this particular thread, they express this through various ways, but this idea of this freedom principle, and in order for us to understand Afrofuturism as an ancient concept and how it debunks and unpacks the notion of time, we also have to clearly understand what John Henrik Clarke's definition of history, which is appropriate for us to understand what I mean here. And of course, history is not everything he says, but it's the starting point. History is the clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is the compass they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. It tells them where they are, but more importantly, where they must be. With this concept of history, as articulated by John Henrik Clarke, really is an African, it really has this idea of a future in it, meaning that history is also a future. History is simultaneously an understanding of the conditions of what is considered to be a past, but also within it, there's this kernel, this freedom principle, the egg, that is something that hatches itself as we move forward. Why is this important? We understand this because if you see the material expression through an ancient idea, we can see it through the Sankofa bird. How do we know this? How do we know that the Sankofa bird can be an African or an Afrofuturistic representation of an idea of an Afrofuturism, African future? Let's look at it. So the bird itself, of course, body is moving forward, it's looking forward, and then it's the head is looking towards the back, and in it, it has the egg, but the body, of course, is moving forward. And of course, you have the body of the bird. We also know this principle, the principle of gender is there, but it's also not as clearly identified until you look closely. But also, what is that egg? That egg is the idea of the freedom principle. So the material expression of an Afrofuturism can be articulated in John Henrik Clarke's definition of what history is, or how we should understand history, but it also is the material expression that we find in a lot of the writers that are thinking about, the idea of a future, the idea of an African future that is that is not arrested by these racist notions of time that encapsulates an African people and wed them to those particular conditions, i.e. slavery as being the articulation of the full history of Africans, i.e. civil rights as being the full articulation of a Black freedom, right? i.e. Barack Obama. We can go on and on and on. So what I'm saying is that this notion of an African future, an Afrofuturism, is an idea that is written into the genealogy, but also is written into the genealogy of an African time, but it's also something that is written into the ancestral and historical fabric and historical memory of African people, all right? How do we see this a little bit more, right? How do we see this and moving down through some of these writers? So let's deal with them. So we think about anti-colonialism, or the fictitious notion of a post-colonialism, is that we see this freedom principle is articulated through writers such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Wole Soyinka, Moshiri Mugo,
We are currently listening to a thinking session I had with students last year where we engaged ideas around an argument I presented that suggested Afrofuturism is an ancient idea that expresses itself as an Africana freedom principle. It is an articulation of a constellation of deep Africana thoughts and practices, of which I call Africa's ancient future, a nod to Wayne Chandler's Ancient Future. Through historical and ancestral memories of magic, use of spiritual technologies, intentional philosophies of life, heretical temporality, creative nonlinear knowledge production, and a symbiotic connection with nature and the universe, Africa's ancient future is articulated through a freedom principle, which implies a constant struggle to delink one's collective self from now moments, reconciling past moments in order to create future moments that allow the full expression of one's humanity. We were disrupting normative assumptions of knowledge production about time in relation to the idea of African futurism, Afrofuturism. I invite you to think with me, think beyond me, think around me, think over me, think through me, but think nonetheless. You can find the full program archived on Africa World Now Project's podcast, which is available on all podcast platforms. Just search Africa World Now Project on your platform of choice. Continue to enjoy the program.
What I like to do most is spit this game like sports.
Akwe Erema, of course, Du Bois, Martin Delany, to name a few. So when we're thinking about this notion of the freedom principle as being something that is related to this notion of an African future or an Afrofuturism, then you see these writers are thinking about this, but they have a political project even in their writing. We have storytelling projects, right? Projecting a presence using mixed methods, history, science, spirituality, magic, technology. You see Okorafor, Nnedi Okorafor. You see Itasha Womack, Octavia Butler, of course, Tony Adeyemi. So these particular writers are using a mixed method in word to express the freedom principle that is attached to this concept, the construct of an Afrofuturism or an African future, right? Again, going back to my argument, in order for us to be able to see this, this is just one category or one particular theme that we have to attach to this ancient idea of an African future or an Afrofuturism. So our next category, our next theme for us to look at and to see this notion of the freedom principle, future is time and space as articulated in a non-traditional or a non-Western way of understanding time, but also as this particular a component of the thought process. How do we map the thoughts? How do we see the articulation of an Afrofuturism that has ancient roots, but also has an expression during particular times and place? We see this ideas through the Moorish science temple. We do the nation of Islam. We see the nation of Nuwabians, the nation of gods and earths. We see this through the anti-colonialist movement, the actual Black radical and social political thought, as it articulates itself to express a freedom based upon a African understanding of a temporality of a future, right? So what do I mean by this? So if we look at this thought and we say that, okay, for us to be able to see what Anthony had brought up and said, well, he uses this particular philosophical understandings to express a material idea, but what is it that produces that? What is it that pushes you that way? It's based upon the ideas of the time and space through within which you're living, but also through within which you are also trying to project. You're projecting, as I argue, an ancient idea that a future was something that ancient Africans was always concerned with. We can see it through its architecture. We can see it through the writings. We can see it through hieroglyphics. We can see the expression of an ancient idea of an Afrofuturism that expresses itself through time and space, that reaches itself to a point where the cultural critic, Mark Deary, asked, how do we understand Black folk in the future? In relation, let me go back to that question. In relation to the question, let me see. He asked the question, can a community whose past has been deliberately rubbed out and whose energies have subsequently been consumed by the search for legible traces of its history imagine a possible future? This question actually is arrested within a particular frame of reference, but is also arrested in the way that time is understood through a Western construct. And what I'm arguing and what I'm showing here is that this idea of a future was something that was always at the forefront of Africans' mind, expressed through the idea of a freedom principle. How do we understand this and how will we be able to make this argument is through these themes, through word, through thought, and through expression, okay? So, and the expression part, and the freedom principle, and I mentioned the Moorish temple, the Nation of Islam, the Nation of Nubians, the Nation of Gods and Earths. And the reason why I touch on them per se is because this notion within which you find in the written part, right? This idea, an African future, an Afrofuturism, or a freedom principle as expressed through writers who are writing about science, spirituality, and magic, and history and technology. You also see this expressed through these particular organizations because they are addressing the conditions within which they're living. They're addressing the periods within which, but they're using different types of principles and ideas that move between religion and spirituality. Why do I say this? Nation of Islam itself, and the reason why I say Islam, and also what is important about the Nation of Islam in relation to you as we sit here on this computer at WSSU. What is your relationship to the Nation of Islam? Or do you guys think that you have a relationship to the Nation of Islam?
Louis Farrakhan went to our school.
Louis Farrakhan, WSSU, and he is the current leader of the Nation of Islam. But the Nation of Islam, if you look deeply at what they're saying and you look at the idea or the expression of the freedom principle that can be captured in this framework or theoretical lens to which we call Afrofuturism and African future, you can see this through a lot of the particular notions of how they understand and say that white folk were actually produced. They say that white people were genetically by a council of scientists. And what they say is that the Council of Scientists, the Council of 24, which is actually related to Revelations in the Christian Bible, is that around the throne, there was a Council of 24, 12 on one side, 12 on the other, this, that, and this, and that they used that particular idea and rooted in science and rooted into explaining the different conditions within which white folk were actually created, because this also gives credence to the notion that white folk were the devil. So what it does is that it takes this idea, this contradiction of Africa as being something and turns it on as being nothing, or being less than human, and turns it on to white folk at the time and say, well, they're devils. Yet they're human, but they're devils because they were created out of this, eons and centuries ago by one of the rogue scientists, Yakub. This becomes very important to understand in that particular notion, this idea that Yakub creates, white folk, the amalgamate, this aberration of humanity, and then they begin to wreak havoc on Earth and the people of Earth for a period of time, of which they think I say is about 6,000 years, which they're actually arguing now. But everything that's going on is that there's explanations of what's going on. The 6,000 years of the reign of the devil is up. This is related to also what they say that Elijah Muhammad is not dead. Elijah Muhammad is actually on the mothership that is floating around, waiting for the time within which Africans and people of African descent will seek their redemption. So this notion that Elijah Muhammad himself was taken up in the ship and is waiting to come back. So add this on top of the more science, add this on top of the Nation of Gods and Earths, who are using scientific methods and very, very deep ideas of math to Nation of Gods and Earth look at math and use math to understand the way that the world is working. The Nation of Nubians, of course, have a mixed bag of using all types of stories of historical instances and stories of the Sumerians and all of these ideas that go back in the ancient past, such as Nuburu. Nuburu is a concept of a planet that is moving in our solar system at a different type of rotation than the Earth's rotation or than the solar systems, and that the Anunnaki, who are a part of a race of godlike beings, live on this particular planet, and every 24,600 years, the planet intersects with our particular solar system. And so this is actually with the Sumerians. This is an ancient mythic creation myth that from the Sumerians who talk about the Anunnaki. And so what's interesting is that one of my favorite, and I talk about this all the time, one of my favorite reality TV shows is The Ancient Aliens. And so it's funny to me because interestingly, this is a historical, these are written on cuneiform tablets that were found in the particular area that is Iran, Iraq, that was Sumner at one particular point. It was the ancient kingdom of Sumner, who was at odds with ancient Egyptian kingdoms, where they were obviously was a colony of ancient Egypt. And so there's fights of who came first and all this other stuff, but all of them came out of Nubia itself, but that's a different question. I mean, that's a different conversation. But, this idea that there's a race of beings. But interestingly enough, if you know what I'm talking about, you probably heard some of these things, and people who actually dissected Genesis and dissected the Bible and other stories in the Bible talking about, the race of God laying with the daughters of man in the Bible and Genesis. They talk about before the flood that basically there was giants living on the earth. There were also notions. It describes, if you've read Genesis, the first part, the beginning of the Bible, they talk about the Nephilim, and they talk about giants, and they talk about, daughters of the daughters of man had children with the sons of gods and those types of things. So what I'm basically saying is that these notions of an African future or an Afrofuturism have ancient ideas, because we can also relate this to more ancient traditional ideas and ancient ideas through Egypt itself, who had a lot of particular stories that talk about rods and to talk about the stories of the Osiris, Set, and all of those other particular things that have a cosmic type of reality to them. And so what's interesting is that if we understand how the construction of NASA itself, and also people who study the development of science in the Western world, if you have any type of, read any type of thing, is that a lot of the ideas and a lot of the constructions of the solar system were actually written on ancient walls. We know in the Sumerian culture is that they actually have on a lot of the temples, they have the solar system that is literally on stelas and different types of things. So there's a cosmic understanding, or there was a scientific understanding of the world that modern science and modern Western racist folk will say that Africans and people of African descent should not have had at that particular time. It's impossible for them. Even the idea of understanding in ancient Egypt and down the Nile Valley, even through Nubia, is that the notion that there's the hidden, the atom. The atom, of course, was derived and understood from a principle, a philosophical understanding that was in ancient Egyptian culture, particularly that understood that there's something that is the creation of everything, right? And so they would pray. It's been bastardized or in Christianity and through obviously Western particular understandings. People, you say it every day. I mean, not every day, but you say it after, or you're taught to say it after you say your particular prayers. When you say amen or amen, that is a derivative linguistically linked to the idea that was ancient in ancient Egypt, and particularly out of the central particular parts of Africa. That really means that is the hidden. You're paying homage to the unseen. That particular principle, that particular idea was something that was rooted in the cultural fabric that transmits itself through time and space, which goes back to my argument that Africans, in a very ancient sense, was consistently always thinking about the future. But in order for us to be able to see this, we have to be able to stretch and to rescue this idea of an Afrofuturism through only being articulated through just certain means, or just being articulated through just particular frames of reference, through literature, speculative fiction to be exact, or through the cultural productions, or the cultural the ideas through which we see through Sun Ra. Which bring to the other thing for us to be able to articulate, or for me to make my argument and solidify my argument as being, or an African future was something that Africans have always thought about, because they expressed it through the different types of understanding of the world, the myths, but also expressed it through buildings, literature, writing, science, and all that other stuff, and through language, is that, of course, we have another particular theme, or probably the most visible theme of an Afrofuturism, through expression, through the cultural production. Culture as being the platform for the material expression of the freedom principle related to time and space, as expressed through festivals, as expressed through, this notion of music, this notion of the expression of this unseen, this expression of the thing that Africans understood as being something that was there, but even though there was, to modern terms, there was no way for them to know. But we know that they know, because they obviously knew, because everything that they did, they organized societies, they organized their communities, they organized art, language, based upon that particular notion that they understood as being there, that notion of the hidden, that notion of the beyond, that notion of a future, that notion of the future also brings freedom, the freedom principle, as been articulated, or was disrupted, particularly through colonialism, imperialism, blah, blah, blah. We can talk about that if you want to a little bit later. So we also see this, again, through cultural expression. And this is where it's become more familiar, particularly when Tayoka mentioned something through Sun Ra. Of course, Anthony, who's a musician or a lyricist. Well, he thinks he's a lyricist. I have yet to weigh in.
I'm the GOAT, G.
Oh, okay. But we also see this. But how do we see this in a more broader sense? Not just within the expressions of Afrofuturism as being, related to Deary, who's the cultural critic at this particular time, who comes to discover. Because again, the Christopher Columbusing of a lot of these particular principles is something that, again, that I am adverse to. I have an aversion to that, because, again, for me, as soon as you say you discover it, I'm going to figure out, well, it was probably there before. You're just now becoming aware of it. But it's important for us to see, again, why this is important, because, again, having an idea of the longer genealogy of things gives us a more longer view of how far we have gone, but how far we need to go, but also to understand that the further we need to go is already right in front of us. This idea, again, of the freedom principle. The cultural expression, right? Expression is another theme through which I am building this argument that there's a longer genealogy through this concept of Afrofuturism. The first World Festival of Black Arts, or the World Festival of Negro Arts, was held in Dakar in 1966, which was an articulation of, wait a minute, this idea that we're thinking beyond this notion of being less than, this notion, and they are rescuing this notion of a future through the arts. We see this articulation through 1966. We see this later articulation of this in 1977 through Festac, which is also called the Second World Festival of Black Arts. And also we see this through the Black Arts movement with Amir Baraka, Larry Neal. Those individuals are articulating this, but even before them, you see this through the articulations and the writings, and also the thinking, the philosophical attempts to rescue this idea of a future built upon a freedom principle of moving beyond through the Negritude movement. Of course, you see this through newer, or I guess more contemporary expressions through Chale Wote in Ghana. You also see this through an articulation through film, through Sankofa, through Haile Gerima. Haile Gerima is making a film that he is articulating, particularly the notion of the Sankofa as I mentioned earlier, is an articulation of an Afrofuture. How do we see this? Haile Gerima clearly see this because he actually articulates the expression of the Sankofa bird as being an Afrofuturistic film. Why? Because in the movie, there is a lady who actually is living in a particular space. She's doing her thing, blah, 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 in very ancient particular places in Ghana, but then she's transported back over time and space to really discover who she is by going to the past to bring forward this particular knowledge to the future. So Haile Gerima, of course, is using, the Sankofa. I'm not sure, and it's something that I probably need to ask. I'm not sure if he was really, intentionally doing that, because he was just looking at, of course, Sankofa means to go back and to get. But I am arguing that it is actually not only related to the past or remembrance, but also a future. It was an expression of an Afrofuturistic principle or Afrofuturistic concept or an African future, because what you go back and get, that egg has to be hatched in a future. So that becomes important. So I think the future part is really not talked about enough, or not talked about as much as it should be with the Sankofa bird. But again, Haile Gerima's film articulates this and expresses this through a material cultural production or an expression. Of course, we see it through musical expressions. We see this through Outkast and AT-Aliens. They are literally using, this idea of an Afrofuturism. We see this through Missy Elliott. I'll pause for a second. Are there other people that you may say, or other musicians that you may say, or that you may associate with, this concept that we consider to be, or that we're talking about today, called Afrofuturism or an African future?
Sun Ra.
Sun Ra, of course. Who's there? Sun Ra?
No, not Sun Ra. Sun Ra.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Now there is a band called Sa Ra, right? So you're talking about Sa Ra, who is the sister from Atlanta, I believe, who's the artist. If we're using Afrofuturism and we're going to identify it, right, we have to make sure that the themes are there. Again, word, expression, and thought. Now, there is a group called Sa Ra. Are y'all familiar with that, Sa Ra?
Yes.
No.
Sa Ra, actually, I'm not sure if you guys know, Shafiq Hussein. Now, they were articulation of this idea. Erykah Badu. Who else? You said Janelle Monáe. We talked about Outkast. Who else?
George Clinton in Parliament.
Exactly. There you go. Absolutely. George Clinton in Parliament is a clear articulation of that. Boots, there we go. Bootsy Collins, Jimi Hendrix, particularly through his Hendrix experience. Definitely Parliament.
Interesting.
What we're talking about here, we're trying to apply the concept based upon what I've articulated as being categories for us to even recognize the concept in the first place, right? So if we're going to say Afrofuturism, it's important for us to move beyond aesthetic and to move beyond just cultural production. And also, what is it that they're attempting to articulate and move towards? Again, if we use those particular articulations as the Maroons as being an articulation of an Afrofuturism, if we use those particular ancient ideas that ancient Africans have left us in the Sankofa bird, and through other articulations of different types of material expressions of deep ideas of a future. And again, the freedom principle has to be there. Again, the construction of, it's not just through aesthetic, it's not just through the cultural production that people kind of lump up, but this is the reason why it's important for us to look at this in a more longer genealogy, so we don't make the mistake and start to put people in these particular places and start to build upon whatever they're giving us. In actuality, again, if you remember what I said in the earlier points, is that what ends up happening is that when we're trying to move this freedom movement, we have to be clear what we're taking with us. So what we're doing is that if we don't articulate these things and be able to really understand them in a way that we have to also pay attention to what's being brought with us, we're going to articulate or reinscribe the same types of systems and institutions that actually reinscribe oppression or marginalization. than when you look at Sun Ra music. Sun Ra articulated that my music, I was put on this earth to bring this world to a different place, right? Another Afrofuturistic artist in the free jazz brand or genre of jazz is obviously John Coltrane. And you look at McCoy Tyner, you look at Ornette Coleman, you look at
Don
Archie
Cherry.
Shepp, Don Cherry, Archie Shepp, you look at Yusef Lateef. These particular artists were literally saying, my music that I am literally channeling from this other place that is articulating in these particular melodies are intent to build a different world. Again, remember, if we were to say, and to say, as I'm arguing, for us to really understand an Afrofuturism or an African future, we have to look at it in a longer genealogy. And to do that, we have to have something within which we can categorize, or the lens and these particular levels to filter through. That is what I would say. We mentioned Janelle Monáe. We mentioned Outkast. We mentioned, of course, Erykah Badu. We mentioned Sun Ra. When you listen to Planet Rock, particularly, is one of the articulations through hip hop itself of an Afrofuturism. You jump in and say something?
No, I just said Alice Coltrane.
Alice Coltrane. And let's spend a
I
minute
was
on.
going to say that. We can't forget about Alice.
But let's spend a minute on Alice Coltrane, and then we can also add to that Abby Lincoln. We can also add to that Nina Simone, because now what is it?
Oh yeah.
If we were to look at them, what are they doing? So even though Alice Coltrane, particularly as we know, actually moved John Coltrane into an attempt to articulate and into a realization into the actual real depths of spirituality being channeled through different types of realms or different types of worlds to be channeled through the music or the cultural production within which he was literally blowing. But let's spend a minute on Alice Coltrane. Is that how would we say? Because generally, this notion of a futurism, what was she doing? She was literally building another world, an alternative world. Because when you listen to her music, I don't know if you guys had a chance to listen to her music, it's that literally you cannot listen to her music and not stay in the same place that you're in by listening to her music. So again, and also you literally leave everything at that particular moment within which you come to her music to go to that place, right? So I think that is important. That's important as well. Okay. So I'll pause for a second because I've literally been talking for an hour straight. I just need to take some more of my energy drink. So are there anybody else? What about Solange? What about Solange? Would Solange be considered to be an Afrofuturistic artist?
Nah.
I don't know. I feel like Solange can be considered Afrofuturistic.
Yasmin has something. What do you say, Yasmin?
I just said no. I don't.
Give me more. Give me an argument. Give me. Why would you say no?
I don't think she's okay. I really don't want to speak on it because I'm not a fan of her like that. Okay. She's good, she's dope, but it's just like I've never seen her or heard of her do anything that like make her appear as that. Her music is nice. It's like more, I don't know.
So perfect. So let's use what we just learned tonight of understanding and being able to use the concept of Afrofuturism as a concept to analyze people's work. So does she through words articulate something different or be able to create, or she's creating another world through her particular through her words, or is she trying to do that?
I mean, she made good music, but I don't get that vibe from her. I just get like the flip-flops and incense kind of vibe from her, but that don't necessarily mean.
So she's fully within what you would call the aesthetic then. So she's
different, but
she looks like it.
Yeah. She definitely gives that image, like, but I don't think so.
Really give the content.
Anybody else? So we throw Solange out. So we'll throw Solange in the depressed rapper category.
All right, y'all got it.
In the Art Basel category.
Wait, who's that? What category? The art what?
The Art Basel category.
Art Basel?
Yeah.
Explain to me. Explain that to me. What do you mean?
I mean, like, I feel like she's really trying to cast herself more as like sort of like avant-garde. You know what I mean?
Yes, that's true.
Art, but I don't think so. That I would argue. That's why I was like, why wouldn't you consider Sarak like moving towards an African futurism when she actually really engages a lot of ancient Africana ideas, even in her own sort of understanding of cosmology and creation. When Solange doesn't do that, she's taking you on like a aesthetic journey, but it also is very much limited by what's happening in the art world. Like, I don't think she's pushing us past that.
Oh, I'm not saying that Solange is. I just threw it out there because, and so back to how I wouldn't consider Sarak in this particular category, because again, if we were to look at the word, right, a word through literature, it's not just, there's two categories there, right? So there's two categories that lead to a same particular thing. There's people who use a particular, an express resistance, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Wole Soyinka, right? Akwe Irma, who they're expressing, articulating it very up clear. This is where I'm resisting this, right? But then you have the storytelling, the projecting presence using mixed methods through using history, science, spirituality, and technology, right? Through, Okorafor, right? And you have Octavia Butler, right? And then the thought becomes important too, because the thought also has to be something that encapsulates, that is built upon this particular resistance, but it also is something that is the building towards, right? It's something that be transmitted over time and space. And again, through the expression, or through the cultural expression, or through the articulation of the aesthetic. So what I'm saying is that the reason why it's important, and the reason why I would say that I would argue that Sarak is still in the category of not a depressed rapper. I think she's probably advanced in that, but she's still trying to reconcile a present with a past, but not necessarily having an articulation of a future, right? And so that future part is very, very important, not necessarily only a place, but also the expression of, not even just creating an alternative world, because the alternative world has to be related to some type of material reality, i.e. maroon communities. So maroon communities, again, if I was to use that as the ultimate expression of an Afrofuturism, is that I would argue, and actually, Tayoka, I mentioned this when we was actually there. I was like, did they intend to stay here? And the reason why I say that is because they were escaping, right, creating, societies that were resisting this plantation, but did they have an intention to move beyond that? Were they planning to move beyond that? Which also goes back to where these particular ancient temples and particular places, were they literally projecting, astral projecting, their bodies or their spirits somewhere else? So that's what I'm saying. Even the place is not just, I'm articulating this magical world, but it also has to be related directly to, as you look at Okofora, she still uses history while she's articulating, because why? She centers everything into this idea of a future Nigeria or a future Africa. So there still is a reality there that is actually art. It's really realizable. It's not just this fantasy, right? It's not just the aesthetic of, And so I would argue, based upon this, my argument, and based upon this longer genealogy, that she's definitely maybe moving towards, but I have not been able to, having heard her for a long period of time, I have not seen her articulate any type of different place, right? I've not seen that yet. She might be going there. I will give her credit upon credit that she's definitely a dope rapper. She's 10,000 times better than Anthony.
Hey man, I'm the greatest of all time. I'm telling you that now.
All right,
I rap circles around Black Thought. That's facts.
Oh Lord,
call him up.
So if we were to, that must be Jamal. We can always say when Jamal gets here, there's a whole bunch of noise. All right, so this idea of an Africa's ancient future, to articulate this and put a capstone on this, and so communities and the peoples that inhabit the geographical spaces referred to as continental Africa have always been acutely aware of the future. The cultural practices and religious forms and practices are rooted in deep spiritual understanding, in a deep spiritual and understanding of the world that also has an expression through material cultural production. So there's a continuation that can be carried over time and space. The future, the concept of the unseen, a moment that is to come, is prevalent, right? The relationship to land, the universe, ancestors are centered around an understanding of the interconnectedness of the past, present, and future, as articulated, of course, through John Hendricks Clark of, our theoretical frame for us to understand that the actual literal concept of history as articulated by the West arrests its more ancient understanding of history as being both history, past, present, and future, all encapsulated into one. And so this I'm gonna go back again, the relationship to land, the universe, ancestors are centered around an understanding of the interconnectedness of the past, present, and future. And we have a duty and responsibility to maintain it in balance, an important distinction between rights, which are rooted in individualistic notions where duty and responsibility can be negated. Again, the idea of the freedom principle that is attached to an African future, that is also basically the lens or the filter through within which people can leave or must leave the stuff that they are literally trying to bring with them. How do we know this to be a fact? Categories of thought related to time, not only understood today, reconceptualized through a European imposition of a specific worldview that divides all of this, must be unpacked a little bit more. How can we really see this notion of an Afrofuturism as being in Africa's, articulated as I would call an Africa's ancient future, that literally encapsulates past, present, and future, that is with us every day. Africans understood this. How do they understood this? How do we know that they understood this? We know that they understood this through the production and the lens through which we understand dialectical reasoning, right? How do we understand dialectical reasoning was something that Africans gifted the world to say that two things are happening simultaneously. Mathematics, of course, mathematics is the science, it's the language of the universe. And through language, hieroglyphics are case in point. Thedafeld Obenga, Jacob Carruthers, Mario Beatty have done much work on the idea of language as being particularly concepts that we consider to be language, but where concepts such as the principles have all of these dialectical reasoning, mathematics, and have a higher level, our words, ideas move us to a higher level of understanding. What distorts us from seeing this fact that Africa's contribution to humanity is the seed of culture. Culture is the stuff that allows us to understand the world, which allows us to see that Africa has always been engaged with a future. It has always been engaged with a or the future. And we have always been taught to understand that Africa has had this particular concept because we express this in many fragmented instances, as I have been.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We could be reached through all your regular social media platforms, email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com, or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ, or Instagram at Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Moiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior research, content contributor, and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies, and creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC 90.5 FM, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on all podcast platforms. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.